Welcome to everyone. Bruchim Abaim, benvenuti. My name is Fabio Benjamin Fantini, and I have the privilege to work with the Executive Board of the World Union for Progressive Judaism. I'm based in Rome, Italy. I've already attended quite a few conferences in the past and found them extremely interesting and uplifting. I hope you will enjoy this session. Arrivederci. Leitrot.
So welcome. It's really lovely to be able to be joined by so many really fantastic people who are united by one common, very unique experience in our global progressive Jewish family, and that is that they have all served as president of the World Union for Progressive Judaism. So I'm thrilled that we have, in chronological order today, I'm not sure what time of day it is. I was going to say this afternoon, but maybe that's too geographically specific. We're joined by Rabbi Stephen Fuchs, Rabbi Danny Friedlander, Rabbi David Saperstein, and our incumbent Rabbi Sergio Bergman. And I'm Deborah Blausten, and I'm a rabbi in London and one of the newest cohort of rabbis in our progressive movement. Because we're all rabbis, and because part of what we're here to do today is to actually get to know the individuals behind the position, we're going to assume that you know that everyone here is a rabbi, and therefore we'll take the permission to call each other by our first names. And with that, the invitation that in the reflections that our past presidents and current president are sharing and offering, that they are speaking in a personal capacity. We're not going to have them on the hook for strategy, but rather let them share their insights and their reflections, as we have a really unique opportunity to have them here together. So I'm going to start with a bit of an opener, maybe a bit of an icebreaker, and just the question, why do it? What made you want to be or accept the role of president of the WUPJ? And why don't we start with Stephen?
Thank you, Deborah. I am moved by a passion for non-Orthodox Judaism. I think that the world is dividing much too sharply between those who look at Scripture and Torah as fundamentally the Word of God, the literal dictated instruction from Sinai, and those who dismiss the entire enterprise as a bunch of fairy tales. And that magnificent middle ground is ours to plow, and the opportunity to do that on a global basis was extremely attractive to me, and I consider it a great privilege.
Thanks, Stephen.
Well, I believe in the power of organizations, in particular Reform Jewish organizations, progressive organizations, to have an impact on Jewish lives and on individual congregations. I really see individual congregations as a building block of progressive Judaism. And so after 40 years at the URJ, I realized I knew very little about how congregations outside of North America and Israel are organized and what's motivating them. And I learned so much about how local progressive Judaism is. While we share, as Steve mentioned, certain beliefs, how you organize in each community in each country is like politics, it's local. So I took it on because I realized how much I didn't know. I thought I was an expert in congregations, and I realized that I was just an expert in North American congregations. And I found that absolutely fascinating, that religious groups reflect the countries that they're in just as much as they reflect the ideology of the movement.
Thank you. David?
Well, for me, there was a confluence of ideological, theological, and circumstantial reasons, and personal reasons. My parents were deeply involved in the World Union. I grew up with it. They somehow managed to travel to 80 countries across the globe, visiting Jewish communities and Reform Jewish communities whenever they could, and were widely spoke on the picture of Reform Judaism across the globe. So it was part of my upbringing and my whole life. My brother served as the principal of the Leo Baeck College, so he was part of the World Union community. And therefore, on that level, I was honored to do it. Secondly, I believe in the peoplehood of the Jewish people and of the peoplehood of the Reform Jewish approach to Judaism. The truth of what we believe is at the core of Judaism, I think speaks to the needs of this generation of the Jewish people into the next generation of the Jewish people. And finally, the circumstance that after Danny, whose shoes were very tough to fill, the World Union selected Sergio to follow, but Sergio could not begin for a year. And they asked me to step in. I was truly honored to take advantage of that wonderful invitation. And it was really one of the most both challenging, COVID hit in the middle of it, but satisfying and inspiring experiences that I've had in my career.
Sergio, to pick up where David left off.
That is for me so really important that we are here together. The most recent 4 past president of the World Union, together with me now in the position, I really want to thank my fellows and my teachers, Stephen and Danny and David, be here in this connection presentation that for me is so important to honor our past and also to recognize the different really approaches how we face liberal progressive reform Judaism around the world. And this is exactly my personal case. I grew up in the only one reform congregation in Buenos Aires in Argentina. And I really, my parents that come from a secular background, look for a congregation to my bar mitzvah, because I asked, I want to make my bar mitzvah. And they told me, but we don't have any religious background. We need to find something open mind, flexible and comfortable to us to come in, and they choose Emmanuel congregation in Buenos Aires, the only one reform congregation. And Rabbi Roberto Gretz, that was an Argentinian that received the ordination in the Hebrew College in Cincinnati campus, he was my rabbi in my bar mitzvah. And then there starts my history, my track record in the reform movement. Now, really for me, it's a personal challenge, but more important, this is an evidence of this diversity and the worldwide network of the World Union around the years. It's maybe some disruptive decision bringing up to the position a rabbi coming from the bottom of the world. But this is something important for all of us to acknowledge about the diversity, the richness of languages, countries. I really agree with what Danny said. We are part of the same movement with the same ideology, but it's so important to accept and to give voice around the round table of the World Union to every expression of reform, liberal, progressive Judaism around the world. For me, it's a privilege and an honor to try to build this round table and to share with all of us the richness of our diversity.
If I may pick up just where Sergio left us with this image of the richness of our diversity, and acknowledge that one of the things that the president of the World Union has the opportunity to do, although I realize it seems like an alien experience at the moment, is to travel. And so many of the relationships in our World Union family are not forged in panel discussions, but they're forged on coaches, on aeroplanes, in hotel lobbies, around Shabbat tables. And that the experience you've had means that you've seen inside many of our communities. And I was wondering if I might invite each of you to share an anecdote from those travels that tells us something about the nature of progressive Jewish community and what makes it distinct. I might offer one to just start while you have a think. That I distinctly remember a conversation with Steve when he was president of WUPJ. I was a student at the time, and we were on a bus in Israel discussing vegetarianism. And it made me realize that it doesn't matter how old you are in our progressive Jewish communities, there's something very powerful about being together that enables organic conversation. And that the approach to growing leadership really stands out as different to me in the World Union, and special and unique. So there's my, as we say in University Challenge, that's my starter for 10. And I'll pass over the baton to whoever wants to go next.
Well, I've always hoped you weren't too disappointed when you caught me eating real ice cream in the desert. But for me, it was perhaps a more urgent imperative to travel and see these communities than my colleagues, because unlike them, my entire career prior to serving the World Union was in a congregational milieu where David, Sergio, and Danny all had national and international profiles prior. So I felt it very, very important to get out and see as many communities as I possibly could. And if you're looking for an anecdote, I can never forget the very rainy, stormy night that I arrived at the Budapest airport, and there waiting in the rain were two rabbis standing a good distance apart. The word was they didn't get along, and each had come to try to co-opt the president to his and her congregation. I remember saying to both of them at the time, look, I'm only here for one Shabbat, and I really want you to have a joint service at which I can speak and which meet as many of our constituents as possible. And I still remember they looked at the ground, they looked at me, they looked at each other. One said, oh, this will be very difficult. And I say, oh, lots of things in life are difficult, please do it. And they did. And they came together, and it was a beautiful, beautiful moment. Honestly, I don't know what has transpired since, but it made me feel like this is what this is meant to be. A unified community, no more 2 Jews, 3 opinions. We have so much in common, and the more we can plug into that, the better off we'll all be.
And I loved being in a position to push ideas in communities that they wouldn't debate publicly. Ideas like the Ashkenormative nature of our communities in South America or in Spain and Portugal or France. And how we reach out to Jews of Sephardic background and Jews who are reclaiming Judaism, which are not comfortable issues, because listen, reform, especially in many parts of the world, emerged from the German Jewish experience in the early 20th century, where reform was central. And we end up in other parts where we're trying to recreate sort of a glory day of progressive Judaism, but the world is different. And for us to see others who may agree with us ideologically, but don't look like us. And here I'm talking about the non-Jewish spouses of intermarriages. I'm talking about Jews of color. I'm talking about natives of various countries, people who are maybe 20 generations away from having been Jewish. It's a very hard conversation to have with the lay leadership of communities. And it was safer for me as an outsider coming in. When I'd be with the community, I'd hang out with them, but there's always a little bit of a zinger that we could leave to force the community, or hope the community would start dealing with or addressing some of these issues, especially around conversion and around membership, and about what's the social nature of this community for the future. So I found it exceptionally exciting. I found the places that are youngest to be most open, and the places that are the 1930s communities to be the slowest ones to change. Anyway, but I found just being able to not drop bombs, but drop new ideas that are crucial for progressive Judaism to progress, to be easier to do in smaller congregations. And in particular, I loved bringing Torah scrolls to the new communities in Spain, where not everyone in that community would have been accepted as Jewish by some of our own progressive congregations. But there was no question about their commitment and their desire to build a Jewish community. And I felt it was an honor and a mitzvah for the World Union to bring Torah scrolls to those communities to see how they would start evolving into the future.
If I can jump in, indulge me to quickly just mention three different ones. One we all shared, the URJ biennial, at which a Holocaust Torah scroll that had come from Czechoslovakia and had been our Camp Kutz Torah scroll, continuing the Shoshalat HaKabbalah, that chain of tradition that binds together the generations, now being returned to our Reform congregation in Prague. That was just extraordinary. Secondly, when I visited Russia and in Moscow, they periodically had a service which coincidentally was taking place when I was there, in which they invited young adults, college students, people in their 20s. 80 people in their 20s gathered in that room, all of them knowing the entire service, singing their hearts out, kind of owned the experience with such testimony to the impact of Netzer and Tamar and the wonderful young adult programs that the World Union supports all across the globe, and the value added of our World Union's family of Reform congregations that are inspiring people who otherwise would never have been involved. And finally, the third one, more complex, it represents something distinct about the World Union. Our success in Germany in changing the status of the Reform movement in Germany. It required Walter Homolka and others to be willing to go to court to fight against the discrimination here that we had from the government that worked only through the communal institutions that we were barred from. It required World Union asking Michael Meyer, Professor Michael Meyer, the distinguished professor at HUC, to write a history documenting how our Reform community was the heir of the robust Reform community of Leo Baeck before World War II, and the lobbying that Uri Regev, as the head of the World Union, and I did with the German ambassador in Washington, with the quiet help of a couple of United States senators who we had drafted, to lean on the ambassador to be our voice to do this. It's unique that the U.S. ambassador, the ambassador to the U.S. from Germany, is a member of the cabinet in Germany, and that gave us a very powerful impact, and we changed everything, and it has changed the community there. I think that's replicable in many other countries to actually develop those. It changed our status with the government. It changed our funding status. It led to the communal institutions to bring us into and where we play a leadership role. It changed everything, and I think that the World Union can do that across the globe today and help change the status of so many of our struggling communities.
Piggybacking on what David is saying, it was a great privilege for me to meet with the German officials to work hard on the World Union side, because we all know Walter Homolka has his own idiosyncratic ways of doing things, and convincing some of our leadership that we needed to be on board with this was something that was a high priority for me, and I'm gratified that that was successful. And then having the privilege of officiating at the ceremony where the documents between the German government and the HUC-JIR College were signed. And when I never forget, when I arrived at the University of Potsdam for that ceremony, the dean of the school said, "Oh, are you the Jewish Pope?" And I said, "Hardly, but I'm privileged to participate in this very historic occasion." And for me, the subsequent opportunities that Walter has provided me to teach at the HUC-JIR College, to interact with those students and to see their development has been very, very precious indeed.
Danny,
I want to just jump in again. The creation of new rabbis who grew up in communities around the world, who want to serve in those communities, to me was the most profound thing. Going to an ordination at HUC-JIR, going to an ordination at Leo Baeck, going to seeing the emergence of the Instituto in South America, in Buenos Aires, watching the development of the rabbinic training program in Moscow and in France. As much as that's complicated, our sense that there should be one central unifying ordaining place, gives me great excitement, because it means that progressive Judaism around the world won't be a clone of US or Israel, but rather will be indigenous. And I think that's, for me, it's very exciting to see young people with the passion that they can change Judaism in their own community, just like each of us as younger rabbis had that passion that we could change the trajectory of progressive Judaism in our own communities. I loved watching that, and for me that was the most exciting. And anything the World Union could do to lower the temperature and convince the existing seminaries and congregations and rabbis, rabbinic groups, that this diversity of rabbinic training and of rabbinic personalities is healthy for us, was also an honor to be able to do. Not always successful, but I think it does create an incredible future for us.
Yeah, there is a paradox. On the one hand, our flagship institutions are vital to the health and well-being and of the present and future of our movement. On the other hand, it drew students away who often then were exposed and built relationships that they didn't return to their home countries, and these local programs do. But then you have all the challenges of the quality of education being standard. So I want to commend Sergio Bergman here for really taking the initiative to try and get all of these entities to talk to each other and find a way to work together in the vision that Danny was just talking about. It's so important, Sergio, what you've undertaken for the future of the movement.
Yes, David, we are on the way. You know that, first of all, about my experience in the position, it's very short because I start in quarantine, I stay in quarantine, I am living on a Zoom, I don't come to any office, and then this is in connection my formal installation. But really, I share your vision, and with Rabbi Nathan, that Alfred, that take the international development position, we start to have our roundtable with all the seminaries, no matter if they are big or small, where they are, to start to have this interchange. I mean, not to impose nothing, but to share experience and how we can blend the two aspects, diversity and local leadership, with high standards and quality of the studies that we deliver. That is very important. And this is one of the missions and the meanings to be our union. That means it's to respect autonomy and diversity, but to strengthen our quality and how we improve to do that. And for my personal experience, I want to add to what you are saying, how important the world union is when you are living in the periphery, when you are isolated and you are alone. Because I need to share with you, not in a position like the president, like a rabbi in the reform movement, that you are coming from the center of the world. And you have the experience how to outreach new experience of new communities and to know what's happened outside. the center of our experience in North America and also in Israel. But I remember very well the crisis in Argentina that we have, first of all, with the bombings, with the terrorist attack, when we have the disaster, the tragedy of AMIA bombing, the solidarity of our movement. And in 2001, that we have the big crisis in Argentina. The World Union created the Yad B'Yad task force. And they come down to the bottom of the world, to Buenos Aires, to say, here we are, how we can do to help you to help the needed people. And we receive very specific help and support. That is not the money, because the World Union is not the International Reform Bank. This is like a worldwide network to say, okay, we are together, we are one family, one people, how we can be with you to create, to grow up, but also what we are in stress, in crisis, when we are alone. And then the Yad task force, I need also to remember Sherry Tenenbaum, Zichrono Livracha, that was one of the lay leaders that rediscovered Latin America. And he came back to there to say, okay, here we are, the World Union. And you know what's happened there? The Torah that we rescued from one of the communities in Chile became to be the Torah around the world. And we start there from something that we receive help, to help the needed, to donor, to give something to the World Union. And was the first scroll from Latin America that started to go around the world with the Torah scroll around the world. In the other hand, now in the pandemic, with the COVID crisis, we are having the huge opportunity. How we can make from something bad, the COVID crisis, a window of opportunity. Now we are having Shabbat around the world. Every week that we are shut down, we are visiting without flying, without moving from our home, to come in this window of the Zoom streaming performance of our services, and to share that we are different, but we are united.
I just want to pick up on this fascinating theme that's running in all of what you are saying, which is this ability to be both hyperlocal and personalized, whilst also global in your mindset. And that requires a certain degree of social and intellectual flexibility that isn't easy for an organization, and I suspect is confusing to some because it's slightly confounding. To be able to manage competing needs, and much in the same way that many families operate, to show real love even when there is significant difference and maybe even conflict. And leaders who think like that are not easy to come by. And as we think about transitioning into Sergio's presidency, thinking about what it means to move out of a pandemic, we are asking the questions all the time. What does it mean to be a World Union looking forwards? And one way to do that is to pick up on something Danny said about when we were young rabbis, we were idealistic and full of fervor. And to think about, what are those experiences? What are the things that happen to people along the way that make them think, I want to look beyond my bubble. I want to be a leader in this way. Maybe it's a mentor, maybe it's a program. But I'm interested for you, if you're able to look back and say, this is a person or this is a moment that shifted my trajectory, that enabled me to think differently about myself in this world, who or what would it be? Steve, right in there, go for it.
Well, I think that each of my colleagues has referenced small, isolated congregations. And I know that for me, that visiting those types of places was my highest priority. In Israel, whenever I was there, it was for me imperative personally to visit not Har El or Beit Daniel, but the hinterland congregations, and to have them know the World Union cares about them. Germany, of course, is very personal to me. I think you're maybe aware, my father of blessed memory was arrested in his native city of Leipzig on Kristallnacht. And there too, yes, I enjoy speaking in Berlin and Hamburg, and of course in Leipzig. Very touching to speak there on Kristallnacht. But for me, the opportunities to conduct the first Jewish service in Friedrichstadt, which frankly I'd never heard of since Kristallnacht, was overwhelming. And for me, it is the places like Husum and Bordesholm and Flensburg, not the main cities, because there, I think you have the chance to touch hearts in a way that a big city environment doesn't allow. And for me, visiting isolated communities wherever I went was very, very precious and transformative.
Early in my career, I started realizing that the music that I considered to be, quote, traditional Reform Jewish music was just idiosyncratic to whatever community the cantor or rabbi had grown up in. So my childhood cantor was Hugo Chaim Adler, who had come from Germany. And I never heard anything by Solomon Solzer. I thought Lewandowski was the true Reform composer. And then I started meeting other composers and realized that every community had its own musical minhag. And those musical minhagim were as powerful from them as any theology. So I realized, well, what holds Reform Judaism together? And I realized there were similar approaches that played themselves out, that dressed themselves up in radically different ways. So before the music scene became very global and there was great sharing, which is something that really didn't happen until the 90s and the early part of this century, there were these very unique musical cultures that emerged everywhere. I found that absolutely fascinating and eye-opening to me, and how much local minhag created a sense of not so much ideology, but identity. It's a double-edged sword. Do you want to spread those melodies everywhere so they become more universal, or do you want to respect the local culture? And I tread carefully on that. I really believe in creativity, but I believe in tradition. And so I love the fact that the mishmash of progressive Jewish worship styles today, and the mishmash of sidurim, I think that is healthy. I don't think it would be useful for us to have a universal musical minhag or liturgical minhag, because it needs to reflect the local stuff. The question we have to start defining better is, what is the Reform piece that carries through all of these?
Thank you. I'm gonna, David, go for it. And then Sergio.
Sergio, go ahead.
I really want to acknowledge this is like different pictures of our film, that is biography and also history of our movement. We are facing the next 5 years that the World Union will have 100 years. Let's start in London and move to the States, and then with our big boss, Rabbi Dick Hirsch, in 1973, he moves the headquarters to Jerusalem. And, I think now we have a big challenge, that is to recognize the centrality of Israel and the big success of our Israel movement, and the powerful voice of the North American liberal Jewish community. And the challenge is how we can extend this dialogue between North America and Israel to include all the voices around the world, and to really use the powerful strength, not to neutralize, not to compete, and not to overlap, is how we can build a network of strategic leadership from our institutions, all our seminaries around the world, our local federation and regions, our international institution, and to really learn and to teach like role models how we can be part of a really powerful vision of what the Judaism need to offer to the world. Now, for me, for my personal experience, I remember very well my first trip when I arrived to Beit Shmuel. Was very in the beginning of Beit Shmuel, like a young leader. I was the director of the youth movement from Argentina. And then in this gathering was the constitution of Netzer Olami. And I remember very well the competition between Australia and South Africa to say who was the first sniff of Netzer Olami. And then also that we have in this time a very meaningful experience. We take a bus from Yael, our Reform kibbutz in the Araba, to the end of the Araba in some place, and we drove out from the bus in a very small stage. Rabbi Dicker say, here we are, and this is Eben Apina, because now we are with a very crazy group of North American Halutzim saying, here will we have Yael Bet. And with the time, Yael Bet became Lotan. And now I come back to Beit Shmuel and to our Jerusalem campus to become part of the HUC Israeli Rabbinic program I learned there. For me, the experience to be connected to our people around the world and coming back to the same place to take over this position is a huge responsibility, but it's also a long way that we need to acknowledge the contribution for every one of our small and big congregations, our leadership on the ground, and here my fellows, the past president, to acknowledge the effort, the commitment, and the goodwill to make from the World Union a voice in the war and a voice in the Jewish tradition.
So if I had to pick a moment here, and my colleagues have all heard this story, it would be when I was 11 years old. My father was the chair of the North American Board of the World Union. As I said, my parents had traveled widely. My father first visited World Union congregations actually before the war in 1939. So he saw what was the glory of European Jewry and the robustness of the Reform Jewish movement in Western and Central Europe at that time. But we went and they took my brother and myself to the World Union Conference in 1959 in London. We got to meet Lily Montagu, one of the founders of the World Union. I mean, talk about linking together the generations here. We sat and talked with Otto Frank, Anne Frank's father, who was deeply involved in the World Union. Mark, my brother Mark, interviewed him for our school newspaper. Makes it easy to remember what he said. He said, I witnessed the power of a criminal dictatorial system and its consequences, the great dangers of mass movement, slogans, materialism, egotism. I believe in the freedom of the human spirit. And America must educate young people with strong characters and courage who understand the needs of others and the true values of life. And you know, you spent time with him, and he'd help really understand what shaped the radiant spirit of that girl, Anne Frank, who could produce what is perhaps the most enduring literary legacy of that era. So if you talk about experiences, it was my introduction to the World Union, to what we did, providing Torahs. I listened to the stories, sending rabbis and rabbinic students out to them, training people at that conference to go home to the kind of things that we still do today, but we do it with new approaches. And again, I really want to commend Sergio, what he has done in lifting up the use of new technologies here of social media and what we're seeing on the web in terms of bringing services all across the globe into households all across the world, helping put a human face on the stories that we had to tell verbally before, helping to make connections across the globe. Sergio and the remarkable staff of the World Union, primarily in New York and in Jerusalem, but also the regional efforts all over, makes this possible. Nothing will replace getting there on the ground and how that impacts people, including donors and new leaders here. But what you've done, Sergio, in so improving what Danny and I have begun in terms of social media and the web and things like that is just magnificent. And it really testifies to the power in this new era of what the World Union must be and will be.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm conscious of time and I want to situate this conversation. And I'm really struck by something that Sergio said about history and biography. David, you referenced Lily Montagu, who for the first gathering of the World Union that she assembled, she handwrote the letters and sent them all out personally. And there is something very interwoven between the stories of individuals and the story of our community. And I want to frame my closing question to you. I'm going to ask you each to speak maybe for a minute on this. In the words of Leo Baeck, who was the president of the World Union, and he addressed the WUPJ conference held in London in 1945. So it was the year after the end of the war. And the Jewish community was emerging from the most horrendous of experiences. So different to what we've lived through now, but also with some really stark parallels, particularly around disruption, relocation, trauma, and loss. And this is what he said. He said, "Before us stands the task. It stands before us as the task of our progressive Judaism, our liberal Judaism, and it is set before us by our entire Judaism, in the fullness of its shapes and hopes. We are progressive liberal Jews, not for the sake of progressive liberal Judaism, but for the sake of Judaism, Judaism as a whole. In all groupings of Jewry and spheres of Judaism, we have too much little Judaism, a Judaism that exhausts itself in belonging to a congregation, and which in such service deems to have fulfilled its share of Jewish duty. Judaism cannot live without Jewish congregation, but the congregation is not the ultimate purpose. It's not an end in itself." Two things: not for the sake of progressive Judaism, but for the sake of Judaism, and not for the congregation as an end. So that was Leo Baeck's vision. He talked about a greater Judaism. And my question to you is to reflect on that with how does progressive Judaism and the way we're building our communities, what greater end does it serve for you? You've got about a minute each. Danny, straight off the bat.
Two things. One, our obligation in particular in North America and in Israel to make people, remind folks that 20% of the Jewish people do not live in North America or Israel, that there are vibrant Jewish communities elsewhere, and that if Kol Yisrael Arevim Ze Bazeh, we really do have an obligation to the entire thing, and that we don't get myopic and just see North America and Israel. That's number one. But secondly, within each local community, building Klal Yisrael, building relationships with the balance of the community, and not just being an isolated congregation, is crucial, because our kids will marry when they marry other Jews, they'll come from other places. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew, and we have to find a way to coexist with our Jewish brothers and sisters, even when they won't fund us.
Sergio.
I really believe that this kind of experience show us what is our future. That is roots in the past, but building the future in the present, and the interchange and the connection and the ongoing process that we are learning each from other. That is something that the World Union needs to realize and to share. And more important thing, that we need to outreach to grow up a new generation of leaders. One of the more important tasks from the World Union is to create the state of mind of the new leadership, that you are part of your local responsibility, but you are a global leader. And the global leader is matched with World Union for Progressive Judaism mission.
Steve.
I would spend my minute emphasizing an area we have not touched on in this session as a pathway to progressive legitimacy and relevance, and that is continuing to take the lead in the interfaith arena. Orthodox Jews, in my experience, are not concerned about connections to non-Jews. And yet we have so much to teach and to learn in this interconnected world. As Heschel said, no religion is an island, and certainly not us. And in my travels to see the efforts in places like Porto Alegre, Brazil, and in Germany, and in other places to connect and have relationships where we show appreciation for those righteous among the nations who care about Judaism, who support Judaism, and who want to learn about Judaism, has been very gratifying, and I think is an important priority for our future. I too share David's kudos to Sergio for taking this new technology. Zoom is the silver lining of the pandemic. As horrible as it is, the ability to connect in this way has been very significant, and I'm very grateful to see that.
So, I think that many people across the globe watching this are surprised that in the United States, the Reform Jewish movement is larger than the Orthodox, Conservative, and Reconstructionist movement combined. It is a dominant expression of Judaism. And I think the reason why is the key to the success of the World Union as well, that we offer a Judaism that integrates the most ancient values and traditions with modern sensibilities and aesthetics in a spiritually enriching manner that is attracting increasing number of Jews across the generations, and opens up the potential for growth that can shape the next generations of the Jewish people. So it's no wonder that our numbers in Israel have doubled in the past 12 years, that those who identify with the non-Orthodox movement have grown to numbers matching the Haredim in Israel. They may have higher birth rates, but we have the attractive ideas capable of meeting the Jewish spiritual needs of most Israelis. And we stand for ideas that I think people understand, that our sacred texts were written by men and women striving to understand what God calls us to do. And that process continued through the millennia until today. And we are part of continuing that chain of tradition. And that we stand for something. We're called to be a light to the nation, God's partners in shaping a better and more compassionate, more just and equal world. And so too, the rapid number of our congregations across the globe, 53 countries we're in now on 6 continents. Here, what we have done in North America, what we're doing in Israel, what we're doing in so many other places, we have the ability to transform the future of the Jewish people. I'm so proud to be part of an institution like the World Union that makes that possible, and I believe can be the future of Judaism all across the globe.
Amen.
I was about to say, amen. It feels like we need no more summation than that. It's quite clear to me, anyway, how lucky our movement has been to have each of you at the center, at the helm, guiding our network, helping forge relationships, and traveling around and making connections everywhere that you've gone. We continue the conversation. So in all the spaces around this panel at the World Union, there are people like the young David at their first connections who are watching and listening. And I'm really excited to see what they do with these experiences and where they go with their vision. And thank you for sharing your wisdom that they can pick up on. I thought rather than closing with my thoughts, I'd actually go back to Leo Baeck, because the way he concluded his address in 1945, it might as well have been written for us in this moment. And sometimes the most valuable thing we can do Jewishly is name our teachers, bring them into our present, and acknowledge the giants whose shoulders we stand upon. And he said this: we must not as Jews deny ourselves to the problems of our time, nor hide ourselves away as Jews in face of them. They must not be something that goes on outside our Judaism. We should begin again and take up what was interrupted. We shall ourselves grow stronger in giving to others. And therefore we must be Jews, must hold our ground, must keep the way and widen our outlook. This is our task in the post-war world, the task of progressive Judaism. Thank you all very much, and see you in the Wonder Me bar later on to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you, Deb. Wonderful. Thank you, folks.